Hi, everybody. We're going to get started with our presentation. I think it's right at 7 straight up. Just to let you know, those of you who are here, last week we had about 55 people or something like that online. So you guys are in the minority, but I'm so glad you're here because I'd much rather speak to people than to a camera or to a flat screen. So welcome to all of you who are online, and any of you who missed last week's presentation. Both this week's video and last week's video will be available at our YouTube channel at Mount Washington Presbyterian Church YouTube channel. So you can always look it up, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So welcome to all of you who are here. I'm glad to see you all. It's nice to see you. And we're going to be talking again about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I just wanted to remind all of you, I'm simply a Christian pastor. I am not an academic. I do not have all the ins and outs of everything about this. I'm just really sharing my perspective of my own experience of having been in the Middle East, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So shalom for Hebrew, marhabas is hello in Arabic. So last week we talked about the Israeli narrative, and really we talked, if you want to be specific, about the Jewish Israeli narrative. This week we're going to be talking about the Palestinian narrative. And next week I'm going to be giving a perspective from a Palestinian Christian perspective. So just a chance for us to hear from different points of view on the conflict. And I just want to remind you that this is the location we're talking about. This is sort of the middle part of Israel, the main part that we're talking about, that kidney bean in gray. We all know that's the West Bank, and the West Bank is the west bank of the Jordan River. And then that little strip of gray down on the bottom of that map is Gaza. There's the Sinai down there, or the Negev desert, and there's some area up above in closer to Lebanon. But some of you said last week that the maps were too small to see online or even to see in here, so I sort of blew it up and assume that you'll fill in those gaps of what's missing, because really what we're talking about is this territory right here. I just want to remind you of some of the things that we talked about last week, which was history and narrative. History is the academic study of the human past, and usually historians try to be objective. They acknowledge issues of power, and the historian presents themselves as an outsider to the description that they're explaining, even though they may be of a similar culture or of nationality of the history that they're telling. There's a commitment to objectivity. But when we're talking about narrative, that's quite a different thing. That's the story we tell one another about ourselves. So to give you an example of how that can be different, or how each group tells a different story, when we talk about the Revolutionary War as Americans, we think of ourselves in the David and Goliath position, right? There's David's the little guy, and Goliath was Great Britain, and we threw them off. But you know what? They don't call it that in Britain when they describe the war. They talk about it's just colonial independence, and they sort of like, we were almost like a gnat. They were just flicking away that was annoying them. So again, the stories we tell each other help us build the stories that tell us a little bit more about who we are. They're usually subjective and selective in the facts that they tell, and they give a sense of group cohesion and identity. And usually they do that by setting up who are the good guys in the story, who are the bad guys in the story. And the person telling the story usually is a subjective stakeholder right there in the middle. And they often, when you're telling a story, if it works to your advantage, you're telling the story in a way that either reinforces a victim narrative, you've been done wrong, or we were great heroes. So this is really what narrative is all about. And so when I'm talking about the Israeli and Palestinian narratives, I'm not talking about straight historical objective. I'm talking about how each one of these groups tells the story of this conflict in their own terms. But one of the things you need to be aware of when we're talking about narrative is that it depends upon who's in power. If you are in the team or the group that won or assumes the most power in sort of however history lands, you absolutely control the perception that other people hold of the narrative, and you actually try to impose that perception on other people. But if you're in the group that doesn't have power, you tend to struggle even for the right to tell your story. And then you try to define yourself as opposed to that other narrative, and you try to defend that dominant narrative against your own. So as we begin to talk about the Palestinian narrative today, you need to realize that many ways when we talked about the Israeli narrative, they really didn't have to talk a lot about what the Palestinians think is going on or perceiving, because they're the ones in power. But the Palestinians, as you'll see, are often arguing against or defending against how the dominant narrative is told in the world or to the people in that region, and trying to like jump in and say, I want a voice in this game. I want to have the right to do this. So that power dynamic is always happening in the areas of narrative. And it certainly happens when we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian narrative. Now, I just want to own my own narrative in all of this, because I also come with my own biases and my own commitments. And so just so you know that I grew up in a household where socially we embraced Jews in our home. We had friends who were Jewish, went to Passovers with them. Religiously, my church embraced the state of Israel and believed strongly in that. And politically, I endorsed the establishment of Israel. All of those things combined, I never even thought about it or reflected on the state of Israel. It was a good thing, a great thing. It was a celebrated thing, and it was absolutely right from all angles. But also coupled with my story was a fear of Arabs. You know, I really didn't have a lot of exposure, probably like many of you, to Islam or to Arabs. I didn't really know anybody. I didn't really even think about it or reflect upon it very much. But I do have some memories of Palestinian terrorist attacks. I remember things like the Munich Olympics, when they kidnapped the athletes. And I just like seared into my little, I don't know how old I was, 13 years old or 12-year-old brain or something like that. I remember things like hijackings, plane hijackings going on. And my impression was whoever these people were that I had never met or ever had seen, they were evil, they were terrorists, they were awful. And I eventually, especially after 9/11, began to affiliate this group of people with Islam. And so I just had an innate fear of Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians. They were all just jumbled together as one category. And this went well into my adulthood. In fact, just 11 years ago, I went to Israel for the first time. And I remember driving into the West Bank, into the Palestinian territory for the first time. And as you go through an armed checkpoint, an Israeli young person from the IDF boarded our bus. I was terrified, like, where am I going and why are we doing this? And this sign was the sign that was our welcome sign into the Palestinian territories. And if you can read this, it says, this road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. This entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden. It's dangerous to your life and is against Israeli law. And I will tell you that I remember my heart beating out of my chest as we crossed that checkpoint to go into Bethlehem. And I was just so grateful that we were only going to spend about an hour in Bethlehem, because I thought, I don't know who these Palestinian Muslim Arabs are, but I was quite sure that they had no interest in me and keeping me safe. It was a terrifying experience. So why 2 years from then am I living in the West Bank? Something happened, right? Between that in 2010, my first entrance into the Palestinian territories, and that's a picture of the apartment where I lived in Bethlehem. Just 2 years later, I had earned a sabbatical from my church where I was a pastor in Berkeley, and this is where I chose to go. In fact, I felt so comfortable. I invited my kids who are in college. This is us at Christmas time. My daughters with their boyfriends, and then my Palestinian neighbors, the Shreda family, who I'm very, very close to, all at Christmas time all together. So how did I go from being terrified to actually choosing to live there, and then even being willing to risk having my college-age kids join me for Christmas in Bethlehem? Well, it has to do with in between 2010 and 2012, I met this man. He came to a conference that we were hosting in Berkeley. His name is Yohanna Catenaccio. And Dr. Catenaccio is not only an Arab, he's a Palestinian. That set me off a little bit. But the thing that really surprised me was he was a Christian. And my version of Arab and Christian didn't go together. I didn't know there could be such a thing. I thought if you were Arab, you were Muslim. So I was really taken aback by the fact that he was an Arab Christian, and then he was a Palestinian, and like, what did that all mean? And then he was a pastor. That kind of blew my mind. And then he lived in Nazareth. And Nazareth happens to be in Israel proper. So I'm trying to figure out how an Arab Palestinian lives in Israel and is a Christian and is a church leader. Well, Johanna really began to change my life as I began to learn and listen. And that's exactly what happened. Between 2010 and 2012, I really began to listen and to learn more about what was going on in there and began to challenge some of my assumptions. So let's talk about some of these assumptions that were challenged. And part of that was listening to what the Palestinians have to say about their narrative, how they understand the historic events that happened between really roughly the beginning of the 20th century until now. The Palestinians claim a historic connection to the land. They said, we've been living in this land for centuries. I mean, going back generations. In fact, it's a joke that you meet somebody that lives in Bethlehem and they'll tell you that their great grandfather or grandmother babysat Jesus, right? That's the connection that they see. They take it all the way back to the time of Jesus. They say the Palestinians are indigenous people. In fact, they're descendants of the ancient Canaanites and even the ancient Israelites. And there's DNA evidence that suggests that the Palestinians and the Jewish descendants are actually related genetically. So they're not just cousins, they're actually brothers and sisters to one another. And then the Palestinians say, we've had this historic continuity. We never left. We've always been a part and parcel of this land. We're connected to it. This is a picture from the late 19th century. This is the old city of Jerusalem. You're looking over the city of Bethany, the biblical town of Bethany, which is now would be called El Azariah, the town of Lazarus. And behind them, that green swath is the Mount of Olives. And then the wall and in the background is the old city of Jerusalem. So this was a painting postcard issued somewhere around the late 19th century of what Jerusalem looked like then. Then we also have pictures of a sort of a pastoral nature, the agricultural part of the Palestinians. These are Palestinians out in a field with their village in the background and sort of represents very much the feeling of the Palestinians at that day and time. But the Palestinians also say we have a religious claim to the land, not just a physical connection, but and a historic, but also a religious. Because for Muslims, this is one of their great holy places. They are, the Dome of the Rock is the third most holy spot in all of Islam. And they also have connections to many of the prophets that the Jews and the Christians share. And these also contribute to their holy places or their sense of the Palestine having significance to them. But also Christian Palestinians have a connection, a religious connection to the land, obviously. We have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the place where Calvary is and where Jesus was put on the cross. And then the tomb of Arimathea is all seen within the same complex of the church. We have the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the birth of Jesus, as well as the Sea of Galilee and numerous other places that are our connection. And here's a picture from the late 19th century of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the ancient city of Jerusalem. Now, the Palestinians I mentioned to you are going to be critiquing the dominant narrative, which is the Israeli narrative. So their critique of Israel's claim to the right of the land sort of goes as follows. They say colonialism was Zionism, was a colonial enterprise. And their goal was to establish a Jewish majority, a Jewish democratic state in this land. They said that immigration policies were meant to replace the Jewish majority and that they fully intended to ethnically cleanse and displace the land of all non-Jewish people. So in the colonial enterprises and the nation building enterprises, this is what the critique would be by Arabs at this time, is that Zionism has an ideological goal. And in this ideological goal, the only way they can reach a Jewish democratic state is to rid the land of the majority of their participants or their inhabitants and bring in their own people to make a majority. And this is a picture of some of the immigration from Haganah, the boats coming in, very big movements of immigration happening all in the early 20th century. The Palestinians also critique the British, and they say, even though they made promises to us, ultimately Britain sided with the Zionists. They say that they gave the Zionists the right to establish their own militia, a right that was not given to the Arabs at that time. That the Zionists, or that the British also trained the Zionist soldiers. And they say there's evidence of that all around, that they gave privilege and armed and trained the Jewish Zionists that were entering the country. You'll remember from last week, we talked about the British, the Balfour Declaration, which was issued by Lord Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary of Britain at the time. Remember that he's issuing this statement in 1917 before the end of World War II. The Ottoman Empire hasn't technically fallen yet, and yet he's making a promise that the establishment of, in Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people is a priority for Britain. And this is a key assertion that's made by Jewish Israelis about their right to be able to establish a homeland for themselves in what will eventually be called the British Mandate of Palestine. But this declaration doesn't end there. That's just the first sentence, because the second sentence says, it being clearly understood that nothing can be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So even Lord Balfour, as he's making this promise, is also trying to say in his statement that the rights of Arabs who are living in the land should not be compromised. This part of the statement is rarely ever repeated or emphasized. So, but it's still part of this, what is called the Balfour Declaration. They also continue in their critique of the British, saying that while Balfour made the promises, he who did not own the land gave a promise to people who did not even deserve to have it. What right did he have? He doesn't own or have sovereignty over the land. How could he promise this to the Jewish people? And then there also the critique by Palestinians is that the British broke their promises to the Arabs for autonomy and self-determination. So just to be clear about what's going on, this is a very fluid environment. I don't want to totally throw the Brits under the bus, but I probably am right now. Again, it's part of narrative. The Brits actually make promises to the French on how they're going to split up this area. They ask the Arabs to be involved. If they'll overthrow their Ottoman overseers, they'll give them autonomy. And they're also making promises for the same land to the Jews. So somewhere in this, you've got a mess. You can't make promises to 3 different groups and expect that someone's not going to get upset. They're lucky. The French back off and they're happy to take Syria and Lebanon and into Iraq as their territory. But the Jews and the Arabs sets up a tension of these, as we talked last week, of broken promises back and forth. Now I'm going to jump ahead, because to the Palestinians, that narrative during the British Mandate is not as important as what happens in 1947. When the Brits now are talking about World War II is over, the British are going to withdraw from Mandate Palestine, and the UN draws up this map. Now, when you're looking at this map, you can see the dark orange spot right there on the map on the right, or is that the left? I guess on the left. And you can see that orange spot. That's where traditionally the Jews were living in what was then Mandate of Palestine. So you can see how when the UN draws up their map and the red area is what's to become the Jewish state, the UN was trying to sort of honor where the populations were already sort of settled, right? But you can see that there's a whole lot of that red land that's supposed to be allocated to the state of Israel down in the lower part of that map, where there's very little Jewish settlement going on. And anyone looking at this map would go, how on earth would you run a country or a nation when it looks like these little islands that are just barely touching each other, right? How is this a good breakup of the land for the new Israel nation or for the Arabs, right? How could you possibly manage this? But this is the map that was drawn up by the UN. As we know, in 1948, the Brits withdraw, and the very next day, Israel declares itself a state, expecting to have the red area of this map. The Arabs are completely upset with this, and they go to war with one another. And part of the reason why that's true is because in this partition plan of 2 states, Jerusalem is promised to be an international city. Maybe they can deal with that, but no one can decide what to do with Jerusalem because who has claim to it? Muslims have claim as a holy place. Who else would have claim to it, guys? The Jewish people have a claim to it as their holy place, and also the Christians. So in sorting that, the UN just says, well, it'll be like an international city. But in this plan, it would mean a transfer of 225,000 Arabs out of their land that actually happens to be on 43%. They would lose 43% of their land. They would transfer out 225,000 people. But the Jews would only have to transfer 1,250 people out of that into their new state. The Arabs don't understand why they should have to transfer one person out of this area and give up any of their land, which is partly why when Israel declares itself a state, they're getting the better end of the deal and the Arabs are furious. Now, the critique of the UN partition plan from the Palestinian point of view, they're like, what? Wait a minute. What gives you the right to give away our land? When did we ever give you the UN sovereignty to just say, yeah, 43%, we'll be happy with that. Like they said, why should you give away even one even little square inch? It's our land. Then they said, you're seriously going to suggest transferring our population? Who gave you the right to do that? And then they said, why are you using Arabs to solve a European Jewish problem? It isn't our problem. It's Europe's problem. Let them solve it. Why are they solving it on our backs? Their immortal claim of this is that the Arabs were not responsible for the Holocaust. Germany was responsible for the Holocaust. Why don't you give half of the German land away to them, right? I mean, they caused the problem. They annihilated all the Jews. Why don't you relocate them somewhere there? The people who were part of the problem, we weren't part of the problem. And then they also are saying, we know that there's this sense of Jewish nationalism that was going on all over Europe at this time. The Arabs had their own version of nationalism, but they say, why should Jewish nationalism negate our land ownership? And so they feel morally indignant over this plan that seems to so much more favor the Jews than themselves, a plan that they didn't ask for, they didn't want, and thought it was ill-conceived from the beginning. So let's back up. We're going to go back now, let's back and go back about, I don't know, 800, 900,000 years, and really look at the cultural issues related to the land for the Palestinians. And I can't say this enough, that the Palestinians are not a westernized people at this moment. They do not have the same understandings that the West is developing in terms of nation states and individualism, land ownership. Any of that is completely outside of the realm of the Palestinians. Remember, for 400 years, they're ruled by the Ottomans, and really, they're just given sort of free reign. They're more of a tribal people, a family-centric people. They're not being socialized to Western ideas and all of this stuff. And so what we have hundreds and hundreds of years ago is this idea of the fellahin. And the fellahin are Palestinian peasants that are farming this land. And how they farm is they do it collectively. They are in family units. There's no such thing as individual ownership. You had maybe somebody would land on a particular part land in this, you would raise your family there, then you would have sons and they would welcome their wives into the family. And so the family units stay together, and maybe there's cousins and brothers, and you end up with these families that live together sort of in a village culture. They make use of the land around the village, of which there's a lot, for farming and then also for pasturing their animals, from sheep and goat and all this kind of stuff. And the villages are really made up these large family groups. And I'm not talking about hundreds of family groups. I'm talking like at times 5, 6, 7 family groups that may have expanded to hundreds and sometimes more than that. But they were all connected by family. They're all connected culturally, and they jointly decide how they're going to deal with the land around them to feed their family and take care of themselves. And this is a picture of a modern day village in the in the northern part of the West Bank. And this is pretty typical. You can see the housing is sort of concentrated right there in the middle, and then you see the farmland all around them. This is more of a modern village. You can see the multi-stories of the houses in here. And the mosque is right in the center part of this village. Now, what happens in Palestinian culture is that families live together. And so in the same structure, you have grandparents, parents, and children. And I'm talking about adult children who would, the sons in that family would raise their families all in this multi-story 2, 3, 4, 5-story home of some sort. The wives come in from other families and join their husbands' families, and they all live in these compounds. It's just Arab society and the way that this would have happened. This is why these buildings are the sizes that they are. But they live in sort of a concentrated way, and then they farm all the land outside. And as you can see, there's not another city in view of that, and that's very typical even today in the West Bank. This is not a crowded, urbanized area. It's a rather rural with these family units. So let's talk about, we've kind of got the structure of the family going back hundreds of years, but let's talk about how they saw land ownership and the land division. Again, not Western. Their idea of land division was simply that if you had to mark out your property, you marked it out with a cactus. Because remember, they're pasturing herds and herds of animals throughout the countryside. You don't have fences. There's not even a concept of a fence or something like that, because you want to be able to have your animals maybe travel hundreds of miles to find water or good pasture land. But your immediate area where you might be farming your crops are going to be closer to your village. But if you needed to put up a marker, you just planted a cactus and that sort of said, that's our land. But there was really not a lot of need because of how much space there was. In terms of inheriting land, the land was all sort of managed by the family. They didn't even think about owning it, it just was. And the whole family owned the land. There wasn't like, okay, this piece of property is going to son A and this piece of property is going to son B. It all belongs to all of us. In fact, it belongs to the village for the betterment of the village. And believe me, they weren't trying to be communists or socialists in any sense of the word. It's just the way their culture was, right? They didn't have a political ideology that was driving this. It just had to do with the way that this had all emerged. So they have no real sense of land ownership. There's no such thing as a deed or a title, and there's no need for that because the family just managed the land. Now think about that when you think about what's happening in Europe with land ownership, right? We have people who own the land, you have tenants on the land, you have a whole feudal system, but there is a sense of somebody owning a particular piece of property, but this isn't true in this part of the world. Okay, so let me just back up. This is Batir. This is a little village outside of Bethlehem in southwest of Jerusalem. It's actually a World Heritage Site from UNESCO, and I'm just going to use it as an example of a village and how sort of this connection to the land. You can see in this picture is a series of terraces, and you see these terraces all over the West Bank. These terraces were built, many of them 5,000 years ago. And it's a form of agricultural management that allows them to have this is a place where there's not a lot of water. A lot of the West Bank is hillside. It prevents erosion, and it captures the water, and enables them to plant crops on these terraces, as well as in many parts of the West Bank, you'll see these terraces filled with olive trees. And so this is such a rich form of agriculture that UNESCO named Batir a World Heritage Site for the historic significance of this form of farming. In the little town of Batir, there is a spring. There's 7 of them, actually. And this is an old Roman aqueduct that is channeling the water toward the spring that then will be, that water will be distributed out to some of those terraces. And I don't know if you can see it, but right by where the water is just coming out, there's a man there sort of letting loose the water. There are only 8 families in this village that manage this land, but there are 4,500 people in the family. And those 8 families who have historic ties to Batir have been managing. And so every week it's a different family takes off the watering and the care of those terraces. But when I talk about a family group and I talk about the connection, they just kept expanding, but it's only 8 families, 4,500 people who who are currently part of this town of Batir. So here's a little bit about the historic record, back it up. 3rd century before Jesus, they build these terraces. In the 2nd century, there was a Jewish village there. They can tell from archaeological records. The Bar Kokhba revolt happened there. The Romans came in, wiped it out. It wasn't occupied for less than 100 years. But by the 4th century, they have evidence of the Roman legion had presence there. This is all through the archaeological records. And then we have various evidence of civilization being there, but we don't know who. And that doesn't happen until 1596 when a census is taken by the Ottomans. And they just say that there's 24 households. They didn't even care in 1596 how many individuals there were, because that's not what mattered. It was households. And the households are 24 families. It was like 24 structures that held the families in them. You can see moving through this how the numbers keep increasing until in 1931, there are 171 households and there's 758 people. This first 2 census in 1596 and 1863, the village is completely Muslim. But in 1931, it changes. And of the 758 people in the village, there's 755 Muslims, 2 Christians, and 1 Jew that lives in this village. So it really hasn't changed much in character. And as I said, now today, the landscape is dominated by these 8 families who care for these terraces and their agriculture. And this is what I'm talking about, this sort of meaning that the Palestinians have to the land. They think there's a historical continuity that, imagine, it's not just your parents or your grandparents who've tended to this land, but your great, 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 great relatives have had continuity with this land. And in Palestinian culture, every part of that land is passed on to the kids. They'll tell you about the olive trees that they planted. And this is part of the stories that they talk about among themselves, and the responsibility that you as a younger person would learn about the land and your responsibility to keep this land for the sake of the family. It's a very high and strong value. So there's a really strong historic, physical, and cultural connection and identity that's formed in the land. This is a story that I found really unusual. This is in Berkeley. This is called the Mudraker Cafe. For those of you who are from California listening to this is on Telegraph Avenue, right by the junior high school on my way to work, and I would stop. And as I would stop at this coffee shop, you can see a man making coffee in the back. His name is Hazim. I met Hazim and got talking to him. And as I often do, I kind of surmised that he might have connections to this part of the world, and found out that his family were refugees from 1948 and that his family was from Jordan. So I got talking to him about, well, if you were refugees from the war and placed in Jordan, where was your historic family home? And as I got talking to Hazim, he said to me, well, you wouldn't know, but in the West Bank. And I'm like, well, try me, And he said, well, up in the Nablus area. And I said, oh, well, in what village? And he said, well, why would you know that? I said, because I've been to Nablus up in the northern part of the West Bank. And he said, really? And I said, have you ever been able to be back there? He said, no, I was born in the United States. My parents came from Jordan to the United States. But he said, I can imagine every tree in our family farm. And he went on and his eyes got glassy. He got very emotional and said, I have heard from the moment I was born about the land that we left. And he said, I can picture our house. I picture the garden. I picture the hills around. I've always wanted to go back. It's my home. And that's the sort of a connection and response that you often get from Palestinian refugees when you ask them about where they fled from. They will, with great emotion and with great connection, whether or not they've actually ever physically been there, they feel that connection to the land. And this is a picture of farmland up in the northern part of the West Bank where Hazim is from. You'll notice you can see the mountainside filled with olive trees in there. You see the cactus on the side of the picture there? Right there on the right-hand side. And then in the background, you see a road? That's a settlement that's sort of interrupting these beautiful rolling hills of agricultural land. Again, you don't see any development in the foreground. There's no homes tending these olive groves because, again, that picture I showed you at the very beginning of the modern city or the modern village, it's that village that tends acres and acres of these olive trees. And again, it's just owned and cared for by the entire village. Olives are a very big part of Palestinian culture. Every spring, they plant new seedlings, and it's a very big deal within Palestinian life. And every fall, in October, they have like 2.5, 3 weeks of the olive harvest. Olives are a big part of their lives, and people from all over the West Bank or all over Israel return home to their family farms to help with the family harvest. Now, in the ancient times, the families would not have had people living outside of their villages, but of course, in modern day life, they've had to become more disconnected from their family farms. So people with various professions might live in a particular city or have some other profession, but everyone comes home during the olive harvest to help. So much so that, I mean, it's expected. Businesses close down for 2.5, 3 weeks because all of their people that work for them, whether it's a school or a bank or something like that, all people are returning home to tend to their olive trees. And olives are a major industry in the West Bank. It's everything from soap making to fuel to, of course, for cooking. And olives are a very big part of their life and their identity. So let's go back to the Ottoman Empire and going back, and we're going to trace now a little bit of this land ownership challenge that we have, remembering we have these Palestinians that are living in this family group, but now we're pulling them and they're lurching into the 20th century towards this idea of Western land ownership. And so in 1858, the Ottomans, who took censuses before but never cared about the land before, decide that they want all these Palestinians or Arabs in this area to register their land. They don't have to buy the land. The land is already assumed it belongs to them, but they just want to register. And why do people want you to register the land? So they can tax you. Some things never change, right? And the other reason is that the Ottoman Empire begins to say, if we can know the land that you own and the number of people that are living there, we can also draft you into military service. So in 1858, they established this law called the Law of Taboo. And what they want is for you to register your land. But now let's just wait a second. How are you going to register the land? There's no modern survey equipment. What do you say? Go to the third cactus on the left? And then who owns the land? They don't have a concept of individual ownership. So who in this village of hundreds of people, how do you split up the land that's, you don't even have an understanding of individual plots? It's all shared by everyone. So the Ottomans realize there's a problem here. The Palestinians are not compliant because they don't see any need for this. They don't even understand this idea of individual ownership and why would I have to register individual land? It just doesn't make sense to them. And so the Ottomans actually put into law this thing called mawat, which means if you cultivate it, it's yours. It's sort of like, if you're already doing cultivating the land and taking care of the land, using the land, if you do it for 10 years, it's yours and we're not going to worry about this. But this land registry actually goes on the books, even though there's very little compliance with this. And what this creates is that there are people who do know something about individual land ownership. And so maybe a villager, somebody in the village, somebody in the family, you say, well, Joe, you go down and register the land. And so the land gets put into Joe's name when the land may belong to Joe and 200 of his relatives. It was just to be whatever compliance it was going to be. It wasn't effective. It wasn't reflective of what was going on. It's just in a compliant way. But then there were some other people that weren't so honorable, perhaps. Sometimes absentee merchants that lived in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, as well as some of the very people who were responsible for the administration of the land in the Ottoman Empire, registered the land themselves. All they had to do was go down and submit paperwork of some sort. They were not connected to the land in any way, likely had never visited the land, but they registered the land in their names. Now, if you're thinking like a Westerner, that makes sense, right? Why not get some land for free, right? Whatever that's going to mean later on down the road. But to our peasants that are living here, they're not even aware that anyone registered the land they've been working. They have no idea. Because remember, there's no internet, there's no mail service. Nobody's sending you a notice saying, hey, guess what? In case this person wasn't really the legitimate owner of the land, we've got them on the records. So what's the result? There's property legally belongs to people who have never lived there. This is this idea of absentee ownership that they have. And like I said, the peasants keep farming like they always have, not even knowing that their historic land has now been registered to an absentee landlord. And this gets into trouble when we start into the early 20th century with the Zionist movement. Now, just because they don't have a concept of land ownership, and we have a collision now of an Eastern sort of understanding or culture of land ownership, but we have Western influences coming into the land of Israel. And so we now have the Brits are going to come in and they're going to impose their Western understanding of land ownership, and the Zionists begin to exploit this. So they gain access, the Zionists gain access to the Ottoman records, and they see this land ownership. So then they go to descendant of, administrator or of these absentee owners and begin to take over the rights of that or begin to buy the rights to that. The Zionists are not doing anything illegal, but to the people who are living there, they have really no idea that any of this is going on because they don't have the same concept of land ownership. The Brits, when they arrived during the British Mandate, realized this is a big mess because what happens, an absentee owner, one of the Zionists, they actually now are interested in being in the land, right? Where an absentee landowner was happy to have it on paper. Zionists come and they show up in the village and they say, this is my land. And the villager goes, what do you mean? Like, who gave you the right to do that? And they're like, well, I have a piece of paper from the Ottoman land registry that now says it's mine. So the Brits come in and they say, we got to bring some order to this. So they order surveys and more land registry. But in all of this, and one of the back and forth promises that they give, they begin to give the records to the Zionists, but not to the Arabs, partly because the Zionists know how to work the system and the Arabs have no idea. And so it begins to facilitate an accelerated land purchases by the Zionists in that whole area of Palestine. As the Arabs get wind of this and figure this out, they're a little late to the party, they begin to be very angry and this resistance happens. So when we talked last week about the conflicts between Arabs and the Brits and Arabs and the Jews and Jews and the Arabs and Jews and the Brits, all of this is going on. Let me just tell you folks, it has a lot to do with land. Who has the right to secure the land, sell the land, live on the land? And in this whole piece of the story, these competing cultures and understandings of land ownership create a huge cultural divide, political divide, and eventually it erupts in military conflict. Yeah.
When you're referring to Zionists, do you mean a Jewish community?
When I'm talking, the question was, when I use the word Zionist, am I talking about a Jewish community? Yes, in one sense. Zionism is the European movement, we talked about it last week, of group of people who want to bring the Jewish homeland into the historic land of Palestine. The reason I use the word Zionist and not Jewish is because there are Jewish Arabs that are living in the land there that have also had some continuity, and it's a different tension. So imagine that in historic mandated Palestine, there are Jewish, Muslim, and Christians, all who identify with the Arab culture, not with what we tend to affiliate Arabs with, Muslim religion. And they are by culture Arabs, and there are Jews there, not many, but there are. And so when I'm talking about the Zionists, it's not for lack of a better word, historic Jewish population that may have been there for several hundred years, that's in a very small minority that's doing this land approach. It's actually these European Zionists who are sort of making use of a system that they know to make it work for them so that they can bring large numbers of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, into Palestine with the hope of establishing a Jewish democratic state. You have to understand that Zionists do not represent all of Judaism. So that in the early years of Zionist movement, it was a secular Jewish movement, not a religious Jewish movement. And even within Israel today, there are, especially within the ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, they don't believe in Zionism. So it's really an ideology that's on top of this. We tend to see the words as synonymous, but actually they're not. So when I'm talking about Zionists, it's that European movement led by Theodor Herzl, who's using all of his influence with people in Britain and throughout Europe to win the day that there should be an establishment of a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine that would be Jewish and democratic. Okay? Believe me, it gets crazy. So this is just a reminder back to the partition plan back in 1948. The one on the left, or the one on the left is the UN plan. And after the war in 1949, when they signed the armistice agreement, the map on the right is what we end up with, and this is what we think of as historic Israel. The land that's in the pink and in the red is all of the state of Israel. The land that is in the green is not conquered by Israel at this point in 1948. The green that looks like a kidney bean is what we call the West Bank. That is annexed by the country of Jordan. And the area down at the bottom of the map that looks like sort of an L is what's Gaza, and that is annexed by Egypt. Okay, so that border where we see the green kidney bean, and so I'll probably keep referring to it as the kidney bean, in 1948, where all the red represents the official borders of Israel. There's no dispute about that. I mean, people don't like it, but that's the established state of Israel. In the 1967 war, those borders get fuzzy, and that's where a lot of our current conflict happens. But this is the boundaries of Israel, the West Bank that belongs to Jordan, and Gaza, and that little area along the Sinai Peninsula belongs to Egypt. For the Palestinians in 1948, this is a very big catastrophe. They call it the Nakba, and the Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. This is like weeping and wailing. This is as significant to them as the Jews being taken into exile in Babylon in the biblical record. This is just the most horrific thing that could ever happen to them. When the refugees or people are forced from their villages and forced into those green areas, there are some Arab that are left in the state of Israel. 750 refugees are forced from their homes into those green areas on the map. Just to remind you what I'm talking about, on the kidney bean and that area in Gaza. Some of the refugees also end up in other Arab countries, but the ones that are left in the land of Israel are poor and less educated, and there's only 150,000 of them left. As a result, there's no intellectual class of Arabs left for them to fight for their rights in this new established state of Israel. Now remember that Israel is divided at this moment, and the green line, which if we go back to our map, is where the border between the red and the green happens. These all become demilitarized zones. And so even in the middle of Jerusalem, the city is split with roadways where there's a barbed wire fence on all sides where you cannot cross from one side to the other. So this people crisis, 750,000 people are forced to flee to from their homes, many of them being told by, the stories go, by the Israeli military or whatever, you just need to leave for a little while, you can come back. So as you can see in the following picture, they take their keys with them because they locked the doors, their front doors, thinking they're going to come home, and left all their things in their houses, right? They just thought it was temporary. But in this, part of the Nakba is that 78% of their Arab ancestral land is lost, and over 400 of these villages spread throughout what is modern day Israel are destroyed. Many of them leveled to the ground, and if they weren't leveled to the ground, they're repurposed and new Jewish immigrants move in. So in addition to the key that almost every Arab family has a key from every Arab Palestinian refugee has a key to their home, and they will probably show it to you, the key to their house that no longer exists. When they begin to flee the villages, as you can see from these pictures, they flee really with just the clothes on their back. They had no expectation that they were being displaced permanently in any sense of the word, or you would have seen donkeys and trucks and all sorts of animals and everything. They would have brought everything with them, but that's not what they understood. They go to the Arab countries around them, including what now is Jordan in the West Bank, that kidney bean, or to Gaza, and they're living now in temporary housing, these tents that are provided by the UN. And just to think about this, the families and the communities are all broken up during this flight from their homes. Remember what I talked about, how important the family was and the village was and the connections that they held? And so suddenly you have family members who went to different places. Some would have gone to other family members who might have lived in another part of this region or gone to another country where there was some connection or split people up. And as they're going to all of these camps, there are 61 camps that are established for these 750,000 refugees in countries like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and then there are refugees that go to Egypt, but Egypt won't allow any UN refugee camps to be established. And from those refugee camps, those 750, there are currently 5.6 million Palestinian refugees. These are the descendants of those original people who left or people who have claimed. So as the people have expanded and exploded, and 5.6 million people are part of the UN refugee program. They're all registered refugees and under the administration of the UN even currently today. So let me just remind you what the difference between a refugee and an immigrant is. Because what I kind of hear sometimes when people talk about this is like, you know, why don't they just stay where they are? Like, what's the big deal? Why do they want to come home? Or they say things like, well, if it's so bad there, why don't they just leave? Well, first of all, we have to remember they have this historic, cultural, physical tie to the land, emotional tie. But remember that a refugee is someone who's involuntarily and forcibly relocated to another country. They didn't want to go, they're forced to go. And most often they want to go back. They want to go back to their home. They weren't motivated to leave for a better life. And even if the life where they've gone, so we have a lot of Palestinian refugees here in the United States, you might say, you have it so much better here. No, their ties are to home. They want to go home. An immigrant, on the other hand, voluntarily relocates to another country. And what motivates most immigrants? Many of you are descendants of immigrants because you want something better, right? You're seeking a better life and you think that if you go to this other place, it will get better for you. But a refugee does not see it. They emotionally, psychologically, socially have a longing to go back to home. And this is very much plays into the psyche of refugees and Palestinian refugees. So let's talk about this right of return, this longing to go home. Even before the Arab-Israeli war is settled, before the armistice agreement is signed, the UN passes this statement, UN Resolution 194. Refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest possible date. So the UN, who's, remember, still sort of emerging in their power as a world country, but as we would talk about it, we use the words international law, is saying refugees should have the right to return to their homes. Then in 1974, they even clarify this further and say the right of return is an inalienable right of all refugees. So in contrast, in 1948, remember that UN resolution happens in 1948? In contrast, as soon as the state of Israel is established and the war is going on, they pass a law saying Palestinian refugees cannot return to Israel, that there will be no family reunification. So even if what if you had somebody who was left on one side of the green line who's now granted citizenship in Israel and you live in the kidney being part of it or in a refugee camp, there's no possibility of family reunification. And currently the law is that if you are an Israeli citizen and you're an Arab, or it doesn't matter, if you're an Arab Israeli and you marry someone else throughout the Arab countries or whatever, even within the West Bank, that person, your spouse, is not granted immigration status, cannot return, and citizenship will not be extended to that non-Israeli spouse. So what effectively the Israelis are doing is saying immigration is non-existent for non-Jewish people in Israel, and even for their Arab Israeli citizens, the immigration of family members or of spouses or whatever for family reunification is not possible. Here's a picture of a Palestinian woman and her child in front of her historic home. The barbed wire represents one of the borders of the green line. And so while she can see the daughter old home, she has no access to that home. Also in 1948, the UN also passed this rule that said compensation should be paid for property of those choosing not to return or for the loss or damage of property. So basically it says you have the right to return, but if you don't want to come back or your property's turned over to something or your property's been damaged, you should at least be compensated for it. Again, this is part of the same resolution about the right to return happening while the Arab-Israeli conflict is still going on and has not been resolved. But Israeli law is established at the same time that says any land that's been abandoned or any land that was affiliated with the enemy is confiscated by the state and belongs to the state. So while the UN says the land should be returned or the people should be paid for, Israel passes a law and there's no provision for compensation for those who have lost their land. So those refugees are essentially out of luck. This is a picture of an an Arab Palestinian home right outside of Jerusalem that was abandoned during the 1948 war. Most of the Arab villages were razed. This one happens to be right around the corner from Yad Vashem, actually, the Holocaust Museum. And in fact, as Israel begins to repurpose the land in where these villages were, they begin to put their own institutional mark on them. And where the Holocaust Museum is in Jerusalem is on an old Arab village, which the Arabs will all tell you about. The Israelis fail to mention that particular detail. Again, narrative, right? But in contrast, Israel immediately passes a law that says Jewish people have the right to return to Israel. Whether or not they've ever been there or not, everyone is welcomed in. Citizenship is granted to the Jews. And in fact, they make available some of the confiscated land and homes that were left by the Arabs when they fled during 1948, become homes to the new Jewish immigrants. Currently, if you want to become a citizen of Israel and you're a Jewish person, these are just among the benefits that you get, and there are many more, but these are the big ones. You get a free one-way flight to Israel. You get free Hebrew language tutoring in school for 6 months. You have a year of free healthcare guaranteed for you, even if you're not working. There are cash payments that are made to you to incentivize you to move to Israel. You get tax breaks. If you're under the age of 30, your full college degree is paid for. One college degree is paid for. You get a discount on cars, which is no small thing because the taxation on importing cars is high there. You get daycare subsidy, you get low interest free loans. And so many, many people want to come to Israel. This picture of some of the flight from the US coming into Israel being welcomed by all sorts of fanfare as people are making the choice to immigrate to Israel. So in contrast to what we just saw of the Arabs, no real opportunity for immigration, but high incentives for Jewish people if they want to come back. So let's move forward. We're going to jump leapfrog again to the Six-Day War in 1967. And you remember in this part, this pink land now becomes all part of Israel or under Israel occupation. The big kidney bean is what we call the occupied territories because this is considered an occupied, a military occupation of this land. There are other parts like up in the upper part where the Golan Heights is. This has actually just been annexed by Israel against international law. And then down in, it's not on this picture, but if you could see the whole Sinai Peninsula was also taken over. That was given back to Egypt in one of their peace agreements. But this is what the map looks like after the Six-Day War. So what does it mean to occupy another country or another group of people? War is not new. And The Hague establishes in 1907. Now think about this. This is 1907. This isn't in response to the Israeli-Arab conflict. They're beginning to say, what are some of the moral ways to go about war? And one of their provisions talks about occupying a territory militarily, because that happens, right? Somebody goes to war, you capture their land. What does that look like? And what rights should the people have who are living there? Because military is supposed to be fought by military personnel, not civilians. So what rights do civilians have? So the territory, by definition, occupation means a territory is under the authority of a hostile army of some sort. So it's not your own army, it's somebody else's country that's invaded you. It's meant to be temporary, not meant to be permanent. And the occupying country is not supposed to have sovereignty over the occupied territory. Okay, so in other words, you may have to take this property over or this territory over for the sake of security and all that kind of stuff. But when things settle down, you're supposed to return the property back to some sovereignty of the people who live there. You're not supposed to do this for a long time. Also, part of the rules of this is that you're not supposed to transfer, as the occupying group, military, you're not supposed to transfer your population into that occupied territory. It's against international law. You're also not supposed to confiscate personal property of the group that you are now occupying. And collective punishment of an entire population is prohibited by law. And in that, wanting to give rights to people who might be accused of crimes within there, it's interesting, they also established in 1907 this idea that you were supposed to know the reason for your crime and know the specific accusation and evidence against you, and you were entitled to a fair and swift trial. Can you see the sort of impact of somewhat of our American judicial system in this, right? These are all kind of principles most of us would think are a good thing. So now I'm going to leapfrog again. So we got occupation in 67. We have a whole lot of stuff that happens. We talked about it last week. We have intifadas, we have PLO terrorist attacks. We have all sorts of stuff, and the world's beginning to say these people got to get along. And so in 1993, we have the Oslo Accords, which are a super secret set of negotiations that have been going on behind the scenes. But here we have Bill Clinton with Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin signing a historic agreement that was meant to transfer this occupied military power of Israel. Israel was supposed to step back over a time of 5 years. And this was a transitional agreement that meant the Palestinians in that West Bank, kidney bean, and in Gaza would then have sovereignty over that land, what we call the two-state solution, okay? So in the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian Authority is established. The West Bank is divided up into 3 areas. I'll show you a map in a minute. It deals with the settlements, saying that there should be no future settlements, which, remember, in 1967, we had incursions of little teeny colonies of Jewish settlers around the West Bank, and that they agreed to cooperate on issues like infrastructure, security, economic health. And this was, again, supposed to be a transitional period of 5 years where this was like the first agreement. They would get used to each other and how this all worked. And eventually the Palestinians would have full autonomy over that kidney bean and the Gaza Strip. So here's a map of what it looks like. And you can see it's split up into these 3 colors, and area A is in the bright red. The sort of pinkish color is what they call area B, and the largest area is area C, which is the tan color of this kidney bean. You'll notice that Gaza is completely in red and completely under Palestinian authority. So let's talk about what that means. What does the red mean? It means that 18%, less than 20% of all the land in Palestine was going to be, at least in this first provisional stage, was going to be under this newly established Palestinian Civic Authority. That meant that if they wanted to hold elections or holding their everything from building laws and all that kind of stuff was under the Palestinian Civil Authority, and also that the Palestinians would be able to develop some sort of local security system, a police force or something like that. The Palestinians still do not have a military, an official military, but they would have security. And also in this, they were supposed to cooperate with Israeli security. And you can see in those red areas, if you knew this map really well, you would recognize that all of these red areas are in major urban areas in the West Bank. Areas like Nablus up in the north, Ramallah sort of in the middle. Then in the south, you have Bethlehem and Hebron, some of the biggest areas. And off over by the Dead Sea, that little thing that looks like kind of hicked around, that's the municipality of Jericho. These are all sort of more urbanized, concentrated populations of Palestinians. But you can see that none of them connect together, but it's about 18% of the overall land. Area B are this pink area that surrounds some of these cities, and those are still under Palestinian civil control, but they're completely under Israeli military control. And you can imagine if you're Israel and you're nervous about that all these people in these concentrated cities could rise up and possibly form an intifada, some uprising against you, you want to be able to secure the area around them so that you can have access and be able to quell any kind of uprisings that would happen. So you see a lot of pink near and around these red areas because the Israeli military wants to have 100% control. And again, this is 22% of the land. So this is still more pink than there is red on this map. The last area is Area C, which is under both military governance and military control. And it's all the tan area that you see. So 60% of the land is under Israeli governance and Israeli military control, which means the Palestinians that live in these areas have no rights under the Palestinian Authority. Now, if you were to overlay the settlement map that we talked about last time, guess where the settlements are? In Area C, because they're under Israeli military and Israeli military control and Israeli governance. It would be very hard to have a settlement in Area A. Would you agree? How would you have an incursion into the land? But there are a ton of settlements in Area B. So, but not as many as there are in Area C. So this is what the West Bank today, since 1993, it was supposed to be a temporary agreement. 1998, we should have seen all of this area under Palestinian control. It still looks like this today, long after that transitional period. So here again is our overall map, just to get perspective. So let's talk about what it means to live under military orders. So if you're living under military orders and you're in Area B or in Area C, so that's approximately 82% of the land of the West Bank, you are part of a closed military area. The entire West Bank and Gaza were considered closed military areas by the governor or by the military governor, who still has some autonomy or some control even over the Palestinian areas. It limits people from other countries entering into the occupied territories. So even if you were a resident of our kidney bean in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, but during the 6-day war, you weren't physically present in those areas, you were not allowed to return. Again, a challenge for reunification. Remember that the West Bank at that time was Jordan. There was no border there. So you would have freely done business or family or whatever going between all the area of Jordan, which would have included the West Bank. I'll just push that back up. Wait a minute, back up again. Think about that. So Jordan's that dark gray area. But if just during the 6-day war, you happen to be on the wrong side of the Jordan River, you cannot return, even if your home and your family is in the West Bank. So of course that impacts family unification. Land confiscation. If Israel's military designates any part of Area C or any part of Area B, that pink or that light tan, as public land, they can confiscate it. They can also indicate that it's for military and for security use, and also appropriate the land. And also, this is what's sort of in the middle of the conflict with Sheikh Jarrah, which we'll talk about in a second, is if Jews held any part of that land before 1948, remember there were Jewish people living all throughout. If you held land there, they can also confiscate and return that land to Jewish people if they owned it before 1948. Again, an Arab who may have owned land somewhere else in Israel proper before 1948 has no access and no ability to have that land returned to them. Also, let's talk about more military orders, and this is specifically in B and C. Land transactions are immune to review if the Israeli who bought the land was acting in good faith, even if the land transaction was proven to be invalid. So we're talking now going back to our Ottoman piece, right? As long as they acted in good faith, it's honored. So this has been a huge thing about how they've been able to appropriate land. Here's an example, again, of a settlement, an Arab city in the background with the wall running through it. And this is in the West Bank. And then military orders, water rights. Big thing in this part of the world, water is like gold. All water resources are the property of the state of Israel within all of the West Bank. It doesn't matter whether it's A, B, or C. And all pre-1967 water rights or agreements are invalid. And Israel limits access to the water to the Palestinian areas. This is true of Arab areas in Israel proper itself. And then they take, like underneath Bethlehem, there's a huge water table. They pump the water out to Jerusalem, to the Jewish neighborhoods. And then the water that's taken underneath Bethlehem and their wells and whatever, they sell back to the Palestinians for 4 times the cost. Water is a really big piece of what is considered, from the Palestinian point of view, injustice going on. Building permits are issued by the military in areas B and C, and they're rarely granted. So if you build or develop on a piece of property and you do not have the building permits, Israel will tear down your house. And these homes are under demolition orders. So you've probably heard something about that. You hear about Bedouins and their homes being, or villages being taken. It's under this law. And the military is not required to give any reason for why they're not granting the permits. These are all enshrined in law. I'm not just saying that's the practice. It's actually part of the law. Here's an example of an Arab village, and you can see all the black tanks. Those are black water tanks. This is actually a picture taken of Jerusalem. This is an Arab village within the, or an Arab neighborhood within Jerusalem. And can you see in the background a bunch of other white houses? There's no tanks on those. So the Arab residents have to store water that may only come into their neighborhoods, or if you're in the West Bank, once a week, once a month, store them on your rooftops so that you have water for the rest of the time, where Jewish homes or even Jewish settlements in the West Bank have access to water. They can turn on the tap anytime and they have it. Arabs, Israelis, water is a scarcity that is preserved. Can you see it in that picture? I know it's kind of hard from where I'm looking, the contrast between the two. That's actually how you know where an Arab village is anywhere in Israel, is just look for the black water tanks. In the West Bank, because of the water shortages, water is brought in tankers, which can be extremely expensive. But then they also have situations where Israel will put these pumps in the middle of Palestinian orchards to pump water from that privately held land to go to somewhere in the system for Israel, including settlements in the West Bank. You may wonder how come I know that, because I took that picture in the West Bank in the middle of a Palestinian olive grove. I wondered what it was. I asked, and I was quite shocked to find out there's a pumping station. And I said, well, do they pay for the right for the pumping station? And they looked at me like I was crazy. Like, of course not. They just built the pumping station. Military orders also encounter things around agriculture. They have 1-year permits to plant trees. They expire every June 15th, actually. And so you have to pay and receive a permit to even be able to plant trees. The military also regulates the planting of decorative flowers. I found that out. I thought I was going to throw that in for free. I thought, you got to be kidding me. Who cares? But anyway, you can't plant decorative flowers outside your home unless you have permission. And there's also tacit support by the military for settler destruction of farmland. And you see a lot of that in the news. Just to give you an idea of the extent of that destruction, in the last 10 years, over 100,000 olive trees have been uprooted, destroyed, or burned. Remember going back to the significance of the olive trees to the Palestinians? You know, if you talk to these Palestinians, they'll tell you about this tree that's been planted 200 years ago and everything about it. It's like they talk their olive trees like they're children. It's meant a loss of $47 million worth of trees, and there's no compensation, nor is there any prosecution of the settlers. And this is just a picture of a Palestinian whose tree was cut down by settlers. Oftentimes they'll go through to villages that are around the settlements and just clear cut them. But obviously that tree is not going to make it. Political gatherings, they're limited in how they can gather to protest or to assert their rights as Palestinians in the occupied territories. If you have less than 10 people, you can hold a gathering. If you have more than 10, you need all sorts of permissions. Even waving a Palestinian flag can equal a prison term, and throwing stones at military carries a 10-year sentence. Military court, what happens when you are arrested? You're held in what's called administrative detention, most likely. You are not necessarily told what your charges are or what the evidence is. You can be held for an indefinite amount of time. And when youth are arrested, they have no access to their parents. This feels, you might wonder, like, you got to be kidding me, but this is under military law. Even when your case is brought before a judge, your lawyer who may be representing you may not have access to whatever paper or evidence they have against you. The judge sees all the evidence, but you are not able to dispute that evidence in court. So this administrative tension is, as you might have imagined, going back to our pieces about occupied territory, really violate the civil rights and basic human rights of the Palestinians in the occupied territory. Here's a picture of a man being arrested for waving a Palestinian flag at a demonstration. And here's a picture of a kid being arrested. I will tell you, I have one story. I heard a statistic, it was crazy. And I really shouldn't be telling the story because I don't know the statistic in my head, but it was something outrageous, like 70% of all Palestinian men have seen the inside of an Israeli jail at some time or another. Maybe because of administrative detention or whatever and all of this stuff. And I just thought that was outrageous. So I asked this friend of mine who was a tour guide in Israel for me. And I just said, I read the statistics. So what does that mean? And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I believe that's true. He said, every family has had somebody in jail. I said, really? I said, that's what I said, but what about your family? And I knew his family, a really wonderful, delightful Christian family, Catholic Christian family from the northern part of the West Bank. And he said to me, he goes, well, you know, Debbie, I turned 13 in an Israeli prison. And I said, what? Like, I've never heard this story before. He said, yes, I was buying a birthday present for my mom. And my brothers and I were coming out of the store. And as we were coming one way, all these kids were running the other direction. And the Israeli military was following them. They only can suppose that the kids who were running away from the military had been the ones throwing stones. But Iyad, who was standing there at all of 12 years old, didn't know what to do, and he got arrested by the military and accused of throwing stones. And the best thing that happened to him was that one of the intifadas ended up erupting, and he was only in prison, he said, for like 8 weeks. And I said, well, that doesn't sound so good. So I said, well, I've read a lot of stuff about what happens to people in jail. And all he said was, all of it's true. And I said, whoa, like what? He goes, I'm not going to talk about it. But he said, all of it's true. I've seen it, experienced it for myself. So this idea of children being incarcerated are stories that you hear that are just shocking to me as an American, thinking that children may not have the same civil rights. Freedom of movement is also restricted in the West Bank. All roads are under an improvement of those roads are up to the military. There's very little access within the West Bank, very little road improvement. Roadways are secured by the military, and oftentimes the roads are blocked or barred, or access is restricted to private land. Also within the West Bank, you drive a car with a white license plate if you're a Palestinian, West Bank Palestinian. If you're an Israeli, you get a yellow license plated car, and that car can go in Israel and in the West Bank. But if you have a white license plate car, you can't drive into Israel. You can't cross any border out of the West Bank or any of the occupied territories into Israel. And you also cannot drive. You can't like cross the border and rent a car and drive around Israel if you have permission. You have to apply to the military councils if you even want to leave the West Bank and go to Jerusalem, even if it's to go to a religious ceremony or go to the Mediterranean Sea. You have to have special permits. And West Bank Palestinians don't fly in and out of Tel Aviv. They can only enter and exit through Jordan. So there's just tremendous restrictions on movement for Palestinians. This is a picture of the Kalandia checkpoint. This is right on the border of Jerusalem and into the West Bank, into the town of Ramallah. As I said, you can't drive through a checkpoint. So all of these people line up to walk through the checkpoint, and you can just see how the line snakes around. They have to show their ID, they get scrutinized, and then they're released, or they're allowed, if they are allowed, to go through the checkpoint from whatever. You have to have special permits, as I said, if you are crossing the border. You either have to have a work permit that gives you permission to work in Israel, or have some sort of permit issued by the military government to be able to cross. This is what it looks like in Bethlehem. This is the Bethlehem 300 checkpoint. It's a major thoroughfare from the southern part of the West Bank into Israel. So these are all workers trying to get into Israel. Going through that checkpoint, there have been times in recent history in the last 10 years where it can take up to 4 hours to wait in line to get through the checkpoint. They've accelerated some of this process. Now it maybe only takes an hour, but there are many people that arrive as early as 3 and 4 in the morning to be able to cross the checkpoint, to be able to be at work somewhere in Israel by 8 in the morning. And again, once you cross the checkpoint, you can't drive. So you have to pay the added expense of cabs or whatever to get you to wherever your jobs may be. This is a driving checkpoint. As an American citizen, I was able to rent a yellow license plated car. And so this is the checkpoint that's available for people who have the right to travel between the West Bank and Israel. And this is a permanent checkpoint, just one car at a time. And again, it was a practice of mine. I always brought a book to read. I didn't know whether when I got to this checkpoint, I was going to be sitting and waiting for an hour or whether I was going to have 10 minutes. It just depended on how long the line was. When you go through a checkpoint like this, they often will just, you know, come on through, that's fine. They look at your passport, but there are other times when they will search your cars completely top to bottom. This is a settler-only road into the West Bank. I said the infrastructure within the Palestinian sections has not been improved in decades, but these are settler-only roads. They're like super highways that you as a settler take up this private road right directly to wherever your settlement may be. Palestinians are not allowed on these roads. Here's what they call a flying checkpoint. Israel sets up temporary checkpoints for any reason on any roads within the West Bank. This is a temporary one. At most times there's 700 security checkpoints in the West Bank controlled by the Israeli military, some temporary, some more permanent, like the ones I showed pictures of earlier. The separation security barrier that was developed, you remember we talked about it last week. It was built in response to the intifadas and the concern about Palestinian suicide bombers who were crossing into Israel. And so this security barrier was built. It's built on Palestinian land inside that green line, the kidney beam. In many places, I'll show you a map in a minute. It also restricts access to farmland. The barriers go through the farmland. Sometimes they encircle settlements, and it also separates communities. Here's a picture of the barrier. You'll see the red line, but you can see how in some of these, you can see how there's incursions into the West Bank. These are to provide security for the settlements that have been in there. You can't see it on this map very well, but if you could see it really clearly, you would see dotted red lines, which is where the wall is anticipated. It will also go, but you can see in the middle of that kidney beam, where you have Jerusalem, and you see a bunch of the wall that surrounds all of this. This is what the wall looks like in parts of it. I don't know if you can see, but in the lower left-hand side, there's Palestinian farmers doing part of the olive harvest. Their other part of their olive trees were on the other side of that land, and they have limited access to that, to their olive trees during the year. This is a picture of Jerusalem, and you can see the red line here. This is the gray part is pre-1967 Jerusalem. That's West Jerusalem. All the white and purple and yellow parts are all what they call East Jerusalem, which has now been annexed by Israel, or it's parts of the West Bank. And so you can see how the security wall really envelops all these parts. The purple on this map are all settlements in East Jerusalem. And so it's partly the security wall that makes it ambiguous what would be the border of the era of two-state solution, of what would be the border of Israel and what would be the border of the Palestinian state, because this wall moves really far into the territory of what the Palestinians would consider their pre-1967 conflict, that border should be established in what they call the Green Line, which is the borders after the 1949 Armistice Agreement. So does that make sense? You guys can sort of see it. I'm sorry, it's just really hard to see, and it's very complicated. The wall also splits communities right up. That's actually in Jerusalem. There were neighborhoods in Jerusalem considered part of Jerusalem where they just put the wall right down the middle because these were Arab neighborhoods. And an example of that, this is in El Azariah. This is the wall. You're on a street and suddenly there's a wall, and it's you can see the mosque in the background. That was the neighborhood mosque for this particular community, and the wall just went right through it. In El Azariah, you're driving down the main street and suddenly there's a wall. There's no rhyme, reason, or whatever, just there's a wall splitting what was historically part of Jerusalem from what is modern day Jerusalem today. Let's talk about Gaza. Hamas, which has been deemed a terrorist organization, has been in power in Gaza since 2007. Their military orders, in terms of military occupancy, has been that their land, air, and sea blockade has been happening since 2007. These orders restrict movement of anyone in or out of the Gaza Strip. It restricts imports and exports of goods, and it also restricts humanitarian aid that's able to come inside. Many people have asked me whether or not I've ever been to Gaza. That would be nearly impossible. Nobody is really allowed into Gaza unless you work for something like the UN or a major humanitarian operation. Palestinians that live in the West Bank, even if you have family members, you're not allowed to go in. It's a very tight border that they have. It's a border that's not only blockaded by Israel on land, Israel by sea, there's no airspace that's used, but also Egypt. Part of the agreement, peace agreement with Egypt, is that they also have a closed border with Gaza. There's high unemployment in Gaza, nearly 50%. Israel still controls all the oil and electricity. Electricity is only on for about 2 hours a day in Gaza. A lot of their infrastructure has been destroyed in these conflicts. You know, Hamas throws bombs at you and Israel bombs them back, and much of the infrastructure has been compromised in these wars. Just to take a breath and talk about the difference between the 6.8 million Jews in the country versus the 6.8 million Palestinians that are either in Israel or are under military occupancy. And you can see, if you think of those two numbers, why annexing the West Bank or making the West Bank have full citizenship would be a threat. Because remember, we talked about and we talked about it last week, the need for a Jewish state. And in order to have a Jewish state, you need to maintain a Jewish majority. And so to have this many Palestinians and to give them their free voting rights would be very threatening to the Jewish and democratic character of, well, maybe not the democratic character, but it would impact the Jewish nature of the state of Israel. Of these 6.8 million Jews that live in this region, or Arabs, 6.8 million Arabs that live in this region, there are different kinds of rights that you have depending upon where you live. And I know that you cannot read this slide, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis, these are Arabs who are citizens of the state of Israel. About 20% of the people in Israel proper are of Arab background. They have full Israeli citizenship. They're given full freedom of movement. They're not required to have mandatory military service. The reason being, they believe that if you are an Arab, remember the families that were separated? If you were in the military, you might be at a checkpoint where cousin Bill shows up, and where would your loyalty lie? With the state of Israel or with your cousin Billy in the Palestinian territory? So there are some, like a handful of Arabs that serve in the military, but they're not required. And because they're not required to be in the military, there's all sorts of benefits that come from being in military service in Israel that are not available to Arab citizens. They have a separate educational system. In 1948, Israel established two educational systems, one for Jews and one for Arabs. The Jewish educational system, say, spends for every $1.50 that they spend 10 cents and allocate that to Arab schools. So there's really a difference in infrastructure. In the Arab villages and towns that exist in modern day Israel, there's very little infrastructure investment, some, but little. They have the same problems of water and other things. Again, we talked about the no immigration, family unification, and it's entrenched in law in Israel that smaller villages and small Jewish towns have the right to screen their inhabitants and the residents of the town, effectively barring Arabs from ever living among some of these Jewish communities. And of course, that would mean that no settlements in the West Bank, remember those are made up of Israeli citizens, are not granted to Arab Israelis. Only Jewish Israelis can live in the settlements. So let's move on to Arabs who live in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. They aren't citizens at all. They're given the right of permanent residency. So it means that they have freedom of movement, which is a great thing. They don't have to do military service. They also have separate educational systems. But where Arab Israelis have little infrastructure, there's no infrastructure investment in East Jerusalem. And again, they have the same policy of no immigration or family unification, which we've talked about before. They do have the right to vote in local, but not in national elections. Again, Israel is working very hard to preserve their Jewish majority with the number of Arab Israelis that live in East Jerusalem. This could be a threat. They're not allowed to run for office. Building permits are not issued to Palestinian businesses or homes in East Jerusalem, or if they are, it's only after protracted process of years and years and years and years and a ton of money that they have to invest to do that. And you'll see how that plays out in a minute in one of the current conflicts going on. But Jews that have a 1948 prior residency in East Jerusalem can claim their property that they previously owned. However, Arabs who have any claims prior to 1948 of property are not allowed to. And for Arabs living in Jerusalem, they have to maintain continuous presence, which means if you leave for an extended amount of time for business or for school, for example, they will cancel your residency permit and you can lose your home and your right to return to live in Jerusalem. We've talked about the West Bank Arabs. They are under military orders. We talked about all that kind of stuff and administrative detention, restriction of movement, all the kinds of things that you can imagine. The thing I want to add to that is that they're landlocked by the settlers. Oftentimes settlers have been in those places where the pink or where that tan color was in that map of A, B, and C. And they have no recourse in the West Bank against settler violence. In Gaza, they're under the same draconian military orders, except they also endure the economic and physical blockade and deep structural deterioration. Most people consider that Gaza is the 2 million people that live in Gaza are experiencing collective punishment. And so again, this is considered illegal under international law. This is the shocking one, guys. If you are a US citizen born in the United States, but you are related to a parent or a grandparent of Palestinian descent, your passport indicates that you are of Palestinian nationality. And you cannot enter Israel like I can as a non-Palestinian citizen. You will endure the same rules as West Bank Palestinians. You technically, when you arrive in Israel or in the West Bank, you are under military occupation and rule. Usually, if you are a person of Palestinian descent and you come into Israel, you're only able to come in through Jordan, come through Jericho, and you must stay within the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, our kidney bean again. And again, what part of the kidney bean? Those red and pink areas. If you want to cross into Israel, even as a US citizen, you have to apply with the military governance of Israel for the permission to cross into Jerusalem. I have to tell you, this was the one I sat with my jaw dropping as I talked to some people who live in Texas who are Palestinian descent, who explained this all to me. But all of this information I got, in case you wonder if I'm lying or making it up, is all on the State Department website if you are applying for entry or visa to get into Israel. So it's part of the official, please. Now, current conflict, we're almost done. Okay, Sheikh Jarrah, it's a land grab. We talked about the prior ownership. This is happening in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a little village within East Jerusalem, right by the old city of Jerusalem. But it's happening all over the place. These are just protests from Sheikh Jarrah. You can see them in English, Arabic, and in Hebrew. So there's quite an international protest against this land grab. Those restrictions at the Damascus Gate that we talked about, the Palestinians say it interferes with our right to gather, which is one of their rights as citizens. They have limited public space anyway as Arabs. There aren't parks in East Jerusalem, for example, where there are luscious open spaces in West Jerusalem. And this was a traditional space for us in breaking our fast for religious reasons for Ramadan. Here's a picture of Ramadan breaking the fast at the Damascus Gate. You'll remember we talked last week about the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is up on Al-Reem Kar Sharif. That's the wrong name there. I actually need to change the slide. It's what the Israelis would call the Temple Mount. This is the third most holy place to the Muslims. And they were outraged that there was a military incursion into their mosque where they were worshiping as part of Ramadan. And they said, even if we're protesting out on the big square, we have the right to protest and free speech. This is a picture of a Muslim worshiper inside the mosque, and you can see the military behind them. Imagine what it would be like if on Easter Sunday morning, we came in and found police lining the walls of our church. The most recent thing you probably read about today was about Flag Day that happened in Jerusalem. We talked about this last week as an intentional provocation to the Arabs in East Jerusalem. The police tend to don't arrest the Arab protesters, but do the Arab protesters, and it really reflects a right-wing Jewish perspective. They yell racist slogans and all sorts of stuff. And this is a picture, we just showed you the Damascus Gate with all the Arabs at this traditional gate from East Jerusalem into the Old City. And this is a picture of Flag Day of all the right-wing Jews protesting and celebrating. The current conflict is all of those things I just mentioned, but it's also cumulative injustice that the Palestinians feel, whether they're citizens of Israel, whether they live in Jerusalem, or whether they live in the West Bank or Gaza. All of those things add up to sort of the tinder that is always on the ground, and there's often something that causes the spark. As you may have read, and this has been very controversial, Human Rights Watch this year has finally started naming Israel an apartheid state. And in order to be considered an apartheid state by the international definitions, it means that you have the intent to maintain domination of one racial group over another. There's a context of systematic oppression of one racial group to another, and there's inhumane acts. So with reluctance, as they said, they're now calling what Israel's occupation is considered apartheid. Of course, everyone does not, very few people agree with this, but even this is a poster done by Bethlehem, which is a Jewish Israeli human rights organization in Israel, is now also using the designation for their own country as apartheid. So why the Palestinian cause? They say, why should you support us? Because Israel wants to ethnically cleanse us from the land. And Israel systematically privileges Jews over the Arabs. At best, you're a second-class citizen, and at the worst, they're enforcing an apartheid occupation. Why should we leave our ancestral land? Why should we have to? Should we have? Don't we have the right for justice under international law, which would side with the Palestinians? But even for those who are Israeli citizens, shouldn't we be granted as Arab Israelis equality under Israeli law? As we talk about this next week, we're going to be talking about the Christian perspective on all of this. I encourage you to come. If you missed the first two talks, I just want to let you know they're on the Mount Washington YouTube channel. I'll post both of these, the talk last week and this week's talk on our YouTube channel. So all you have to do is type in Mount Washington Presbyterian Church YouTube channel and it'll come up and these will be posted. And so if you missed something or want to see it again, if I can figure out how to do it, I will post a document with all of these slides on them. I know this is a lot of information so that you could print it out like in 7 or 8 pages. I think there were 131 slides today. It's a lot, but if you want to see 9 to a page, you could download it or look at it and look at this a little bit more. But I want to finish this talk with just a story like I did last time. I talked about a friend I know, a Jewish man I know up in Galilee. This is an Arab man I know in Bethlehem. Khalil is second from the left in this picture with the light blue shirt on. I met Khalil in 2012 when I was living there as part of my sabbatical. Khalil is just an ordinary man trying to feed his family, and he sells coffee that he makes in his home kitchen and walks to the checkpoint and sells coffee for a couple shekels to people waiting in line. I met Khalil one day when waiting in line, there was no one behind me, and he was standing there. And I had seen him. I never bought coffee from him, but I started a conversation because there was nothing else to do. You're waiting in line for an hour, so why not? Anyway, Khalil and I became friends, and he is a very deeply religious Muslim man. I was a little freaked out about meeting Khalil and his family for the first time. I won't kid you. I'd really never been in a Muslim home. He lives in a refugee camp. The home he first took me to, he's since kind of upgraded, was extremely poor. And it was a little unsettling for me. But as I got to know Khalil, the one thing I learned about him, and he said this often, He would talk about that he holds no animosity against the Israelis. He said, we have to get along. He said, my faith tells me that I'm supposed to love others. I was a little surprised to hear that because of my stereotypes of Muslim people. Then between one of the trips that I went, I saw on Facebook that Khalil had been the victim of a midnight raid by the Israeli military. Remember, he lives in Area A, which is not supposed to have military oversight, but they had come into his home in the middle of the night, routed all of his family out of their beds, and they sent a military attack dog to attack Khalil. The dog had a muzzle on, but head-butted him so that his whole face, and he showed these pictures on Facebook, was completely bloodied and swollen. I was just outraged knowing this gentleman and wondered what had happened. And so several months later, I was back in Bethlehem and I ran into Khalil. We had coffee together and I asked him about it. And it was so funny. He said, you know what? At the end of the day, they decided they had the wrong address. And he said, I wasn't arrested. They just made a mistake. And I said, Khalil, how can you be so forgiving? I mean, I saw the pictures. You were pretty bloodied. He said, my faith tells me that hate isn't the answer. That if we don't learn to love each other, we're never going to find a way forward. So when you talk to Khalil and you find out what his hopes and dreams are, he's like all the rest of us. Khalil says, I just want a better world for my kids. I don't want this to stay. Yes, this needs to change. I don't like the occupation. But if we have to choose love instead of hate, or this will never be a better world for my kids or their kids. When it really comes down to it, at the bottom of all of these narratives, Jewish, Palestinian, whoever, they all want the same things we don't. They want to be respected. They want to have basic human rights. They want to have the opportunities to thrive. Khalil, or my friend Dory from last week's talk, or anybody I've ever met, share that same common humanity, a desire for a better world, not only for themselves, but especially for their children. So that's it for tonight. Sorry we ran a little over, but I hope to see all of you next week.